for a person who needs to summarize this into a blog post.
Is Reza here?
Yeah, I don't think he is. I think he didn't even see that he won the grand prize. I'll contact him later just to make sure he knows. But I'm sure he can just watch the recording. I think that should be fine. I also made things easy because if you just read the red parts, it pretty much reads like a short text. So you can just paste those things together in a document. It might actually be enough. I don't know. So yeah, my idea for this meeting, I mean, it was prompted by a couple of things. The first definitely is the recent activities we did, meeting those students from Vienna and starting all the conversations that we had around those meetings amongst ourselves about, okay, what type of, contribution we could make. And I think that these are, let's say, the most concrete, most situated discussions we had on a broader topic, which has been raised from time to is raised from time to time about, okay, how is this theory gonna connect, if in any way, to what people are doing elsewhere? Right now, what we do get from time to time is very interesting presentations that kind of summarize, kind of parts or aspects of political processes that members of the SDP have participated in. So Renzo and Victor did this for the last two meetings here, talking about the courier strikes in Brazil that they were part of. But Renzo also did it a couple of months ago, I think a year ago, when he presented on the student occupations as 2017. There are other attempts that we did in writing to discuss, for example, the June protests in Brazil, and we're going to have a second chance of doing that. But it's mostly a sort of retrospective test of whether, with the tools we have, we get to say more about the events that happened. And I really like the way that Renzo phrased this, Renzo and Victor, that, well, there is something about failures in the left, failures in politics, which they distinguish them from defeats, because failures, they have kind of an internal cause and not just an external cause. And that sometimes it's hard to work through what those reasons are. So in these retrospective activities we do, I think we already learned something about how our crazy categories might be helpful. But with these debates we had, and we're going to have more conversations with the students now in February, and they say here that they packed up their occupation now. So I'm not sure what's the status of what they're doing right now, but I mean, at least on paper, we're meeting them again. And I do think that some people in SDP are interested in continuing exploring this venue of what else we could do and who else could we meet, and if we could be of use in some sense. So that kind of prompted to me this idea of, okay, can we organize our thoughts about this a bit? Especially one idea that I felt was a point I tried to make in one of our meetings, but I didn't manage to structure that argument very well, but I thought it was worth trying again, which concerns the difference between passing along some knowledge, counseling, giving suggestions and things like this, and something else, a secret third thing that we could do, which I think, I'm not sure if it's totally possible, even though I have some hints that it is from other projects, but that has some analogy, at least, with procedures and concerns that psychoanalysis has, which is, until very recently, my main profession. So that's also where I'm coming from with this. Like, it might be useful because it's something I have some knowledge of. So my idea was to propose something as a kind of, okay, this is kind of a possible way of approaching it. I'm not sure if it's the best way, but if we do follow this thread, this is a way of starting the discussion in a more structured way. So what I did was to prepare kind of just talking points, really. As I said here, my idea is just to present a kind of structured kind of approach to what would be an analysis that is focused on organizations, so that we can debate it. And hopefully these tools or this way of thinking about it is something we can see if it's also valid for our own organization. We are also in a moment of reassessing how we want to structure things, reevaluating what is the core part of the project, what are things that, you know, we need to invest more or less in. Even the idea of, you know, looking at that new function in WhatsApp and saying, okay, how does it fit our own structure? That's a kind of problem of thinking about how we are organized. So it's a good test to see if the ideas in the argument I'm presenting, it applies to ourselves before it applies to others. And I'm okay if we don't cover all the points I set up here. We always end up adding too much. I'd like us to feel like from the conversation, if the conversation is like picking up and people are interested in the topic, I think it's good if we just discuss, you know, part of it and then pick it up again later on. I mean, I'd be willing to meet outside of our Monday meetings in case this is not, let's say, this doesn't become just a theoretical discussion on psychoanalysis and politics, but becomes like, if we feel like, okay, there's a group of people here who would like to continue to see if this is a viable kind of method or a viable procedure for interventions, then this smaller group can continue to meet and discuss these things elsewhere as well, if we don't want to take time over Monday meetings anyway. But generally, the strategy I thought is to first give you guys some, let me already have this thing here in place. Give you guys some idea of how I'm thinking that psychoanalysis is useful, which I think it's not exactly a common approach. It's a very particular one, which I think it's a bit more productive, more useful as well. Then my idea was to show that, you know, okay, let's go back and see how this approach fits with the stuff we already developed. So this would be a bit of a recapitulation of points things we developed in the SCP. I'm okay if we need to skip this to move a bit quicker. I understand that everyone here has kind of a different level of engagement with the STP. So some people are more aware of what we already done. Others are getting to know us a bit more. So I also would like to make myself available in case you would, you know, really want an introduction to what we already developed. I'm all for scheduling separate meetings, like one-to-one meetings, just to try to give people an introduction of like the basic points of what we did this far, you know? By the way, I'm just going to make someone else a co-host so they can also let other people in the meeting. Anyone wants to be a co-host, just so can.
I can do it.
Okay, just find you here. Oh, fuck. Okay. Yeah, so if we need to skip this kind of redescription of our project, my idea was just to skip to this. We can just skip or get to the third part, which would be, okay, how do we, using our tools, taking into consideration a certain analogy or comparison to psychoanalysis, how do we look at what we could call like pathologies of organization, which would be problems that are proper to political organization. They don't exist elsewhere. They don't exist in every organization. It's not just management problems. They're problems of politically organized, right? And that are intrinsic and not just the effect of external forces. So things like that. And finally, which is something I'm not really counting on doing today, but I just wanted to add this here in case we miraculously get to that point. Ideas for how to operationalize all of what we're going to discuss. So how could this look in practice, right? Which I think I do have some ideas, but it's okay if we get to it at some other point. We don't talk too much about psychoanalysis here, which for me is refreshing. I generally have a kind of allergy that I've developed over the years to using analytic concepts to describe like large scale social dynamics where, you know, modernity discourse is perversion, or religion is like neurosis or something like this. I don't see the political usefulness of that, even though and it's kind of proportional. The more I feel this allergy with regards to it, the more I also trust psychoanalysis somehow. So it's not because I don't find it useful, I don't find it effective, but precisely because I do, I think I'm also a bit clearer these days on the limits of where and how it is effective. So I do think that there are insights that we can take, but my personal position on this matter is that we should be slightly skeptical, or at least I'm going to present to you a view that's slightly skeptical of the uses that we make of psychoanalysis in politics. So my impression is that, as I say here, I have a kind of a problem with using analytic concepts to describe large-scale social dynamics. And I actually don't believe that we know enough about how psychoanalysis works. Like, I know it works, I've seen it work, but I don't know why it works that well. And I don't think that not knowing is a positive, amazing thing about psychoanalysis. I think that's a cop-out. We just don't know. There are some things that are still big theoretical black holes of psychoanalysis, and not knowing that makes it very hard to generalize and make broad statements about social life, political life, without serious philosophical kind of enxerto. I don't know how I say this in English, like, you know, stuffing of a lot of unconditioned philosophical predilection. So between Marx and Freud, you can put whoever you want between the two and close that bridge. So that's something I'd like us to be wary of. I think that we don't know enough. It's not because we know enough that we can make that bridge. I think that bridge is sometimes poorly made because we're covering over things that we still don't know. It's not a problem, it's just the case. But that doesn't mean we cannot learn something from psychoanalysis. But the thing that the core proposition here that I'd like to make is that probably we left, and there was good reason why psychoanalysis was useful in other moments and the way that it was, but we probably left the period where the angle through which you can see compatibility between psychoanalysis and politics is the theoretical angle. So you look at the theory of whatever Freud wrote about a death drive. You look at the theory of value, and then you say surplus enjoyment is like surplus value, or you make some connection like that. And then, of course, the glue between the two is your favorite philosopher, who is, you know, explaining why enjoyment and the body actually concern the creative life force that relates to labor in some way. So I don't think that we are still in that moment. Just in the same way that political theorists are being more and more filtered through real organizational problems and real political impasses. Like, sure, very nice that you've solved the issue of how being is common and how we should be solidarity. We should display solidarity to one another. But what about, you know, actual political life? I think that the more this is happening, it's becoming clear to me that if we do want to try to keep psychoanalysis in the conversation, the focus needs to change from big theoretical speculative concepts of metapsychology to the actual practical experience of psychoanalysis. So what we actually do as analysts, which is not really in the books. Psychoanalysts already need to deal with a double logic of what we actually do versus how we tell people that we do things, right? In the books, we are like Zen masters of language who just pick up on the real and whatever, but in practice, that's really not how things go. So that distinction, I think, is already relevant inside of psychoanalysis, and I think it's becoming more relevant when we try to find useful contribution to one field to another. With the added benefit also that it also means that we need politics more than in the past. So that kind of asymmetry where psychoanalysis is supposedly useful to explain something that's happening in politics, and it also feels a bit superior, like it knows something about political life that politics doesn't know about psychoanalysis. I think that period is also ending, and we have a bit more of a symmetrical situation where there are problems in psychoanalysis that are institutional, organizational, ideological, economical, and from that perspective, psychoanalysis is just like any other practice that can be analyzed with Marxist categories. And there are issues that it's also psychoanalysis singularly equipped to deal because of its practice, not because of its theory. And in that sense, it might have some contribution, right? So in practice, or for us here at least, what does this mean? It means that I think that there is some core analytic experience, something that we actually do that concerns things like how we listen to people, what transference is, processes of like very ordinary processes of symbolization of something which was out of place in somebody's speech and now has a place. But those sort of smaller, minor parts of the analytic endeavor that are usually associated like early Lacan, like the naive part of theory. But that's what psychoanalysts actually think about there. Like I think I mentioned this somewhere here. It's quite amazing that I mean, I know more psychoanalysts who use concepts like full speech and empty speech, things that Lacan developed in the 50s to actually deal with patients, than psychoanalysts who use the formulas of sexuation and the theory of the non-all to actually influence how you clinically listen to people and things like this. So it's an interesting disjunction in Lacanian theory where things that have the least clinical bearing are the ones that politics picks up on most easily. So the symptom, discourse theory, the non-all, whatever, the theory of the latter, whatever, and the things that do have like are proven to be effective in the weirdest and most surprising ways, you know, issues of free association, resistance, you know, the difference between kind of types of speech in analysis or handling of transference. There is no real big political thesis around these things or ways of picking up on it and using it anyway. So I find that kind of interesting and something that I'd like to focus on rather than on this big thing. So as I say, like my idea is for us to, yes, we're going to try to make some associations with psychoanalysis, but not to learn from what psychoanalysis says it is, in the sense of its big theory books and so on, but focusing on the idea that what analysts do and the concepts that help us do what we do, those constitute the core contribution that psychoanalysis can make to politics, because those are the things we really could not miss, like let go and still be psychoanalysts. So those are the things that actually constitute the core of this practice. And I feel like often there is a bargain where we say, don't touch these things, don't use them, they don't think about them, take the fat part, you know, the excessive part of the theory. We don't have a use for it, so we can find a use for it in your turf. So still to find anyone who uses the 4 discourses in clinical practice, like realizing a patient speaks like in the master's discourse, there is no intervention for this. You're not listening singularly to anyone when you do this. It's kind of meant to be used in philosophy books about capitalism and, you know, Hegel or whatever. There's something to this that's weird, something to think about, I think. So my idea is to look at what we do a bit more, right? And I think that when you look from that perspective, my impression is that a lot of things that look a bit irrelevant or secondary start looking like they're a bit more central. And I've been working on this, I mean, not here in our group, but I've been working this in parallel. And I do think that it's quite far-reaching how much you can redescribe most of analytic theory from a standpoint that privileges its practice. That doesn't mean what usually it does when this argument is brought up. People who, for example, dismiss theory or dismiss intellectual pursuits in psychoanalysis because it's not clinical practice. This is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is an even more interesting theory, an even more speculative approach, an even more interesting intellectual pursuit to be had if you give a bit more precedence to the things we do rather than the things we need to say to ourselves that we do in order to keep on going, which is slightly different. So it's not a matter of, let's say, kind of pitting the clinic versus the theory. That's not what I'm proposing. But for example, one of these not changes, but one of these different emphases that I think are relevant here, and that I think you should already start seeing how I think this can shed some light on our work, is that even though I think the vulgata, right, the way we usually discuss psychoanalysis is kind of framed on what the patient says, what the analyst says back to the patient, how we intervene, right? The patient says something and then we punctuate in this or that way. I think that the formal structure of psychoanalysis, what we're actually doing, is much clearer, even though it might be a bit enigmatic if you put it in those terms. If you realize that you can actually evaluate clinical work much better in terms of listening than in terms of speaking, in the sense that what we do is to listen, but as analysts, we are not, our main commitment is not to speak, which is already something that helps clarify why Lacan's inventions are all kind of silent, right? Variable length session, the idea that where you end the session can be a meaningful intervention, right? Or even the idea that when you're intervening with an interpretation, as it's usually called, you're doing more listening rather than you're doing speaking, which is a weird idea, but I think it's also useful as a kind of general image for what the clinic is. And more than that, you can actually measure much better if a patient is changing in any way by what they are capable of listening to, much more than about what they're capable of saying. I mean, the idea that you need to be able to account for yourself, narrate your life, describe what's happening to you, say, share with others intimate details of your life. I mean, I think that, Foucault was already very, very good in clarifying that this kind of excessive production of a discourse on sexuality doesn't necessarily have anything freeing about it. But I do think that that never was really the core of either Freud or Lacan's procedure. I mean, you do get a much better sense of an analysis that is moving ahead by how much patients can listen to themselves. And that's pretty much what you're trying to do when you end a session somewhere, right? And it creates a clear continuity between analysans or patients and analysts, because my job is to listen. I'm helping somebody to learn to listen to themselves and to others. Well, at some point, those two things can meet, and an analysand can be an analyst, which is exactly Lacan's kind of definition of the end of analysis, which is the move from the position of patient or an analysand to the position of analyst. So I think that even though it might be a bit counterintuitive, that approach, that first change, which is to move away from what's the structure of speech and signifier or whatever, and move to the practice, which is more centered on listening than on speech, is already useful, because I think some complicated concepts start falling into place. It's a bit easier to see how they relate. And it also clarifies the sort of strange property that interventions in psychoanalysis have. And I'm mentioning this and focusing on this because it's this sort of strange property, which not only do I see it regularly in clinical work, I've seen it happen elsewhere in projects that I was involved politically, where we did have a kind of intuitive, analytic kind of approach to the way that we created interactions between different organizations and so on, which was this circle of studies of idea and ideology. So I have the intuition that it is possible to kind of strive to reproduce similar properties or similar effects at a different scale with a different type of interaction with different types of agents, where we're not really dealing with a particular individual's, psychic life, but we're dealing with organizations and other things. So that's also where the analogy is going, just to give you guys an idea. Also, I think that, again, the shift from speech to listening also helps seeing where the connection might be, because one thing is for us to focus too much on what the other is giving us and the structure of language or whatever, and then worry about what we have to say back that will produce an effect, right? The other thing is to have the much clearer, simpler, and kind of traditional, in a sense, theory of autonomy that we have in politics, where you kind of want to be able to connect with other organizations for them to have more autonomy over what they do. And the idea that you listen so that others can listen to themselves and listen to others in new ways, and that this is a good measure of an effective intervention. I think it translates more easily to things we're talking about, things we're considering. It also, I think, gives a clearer sense to how much an analysis is connected with the production of a richer model of the patient's own commitments than the one that they can come into analysis with. So this idea that you're kind of, there's some weird reflective kind of thing going on. So just to explain why I'm focusing on this. And the sort of properties of interventions and effects that analysis can produce that I'm interested in checking with you guys, if you think, first, is desirable in other contexts, and second, effectively checking if these things are possible to be produced in such different contexts, is things like, for example, interventions in analysis are of such way that we can not do anything and it is an intervention. For example, where it would be expected that you would intervene, that you would say something, and you just drop the ball. You don't pick up the game, and that has effects. Or interventions that you do that are not cognitively or consciously apprehended by the patient, but do have consequences, in the sense that you say something or a session ends. If I ask a person, like, 3 days later, if that session was important, they think nothing happened. Or if they do feel like it was important, they might not be able to tell why it was, because something is happening at a level which is not requiring the sort of cognitive kind of accounting to work, right? Which again connects with the third point, which is often interventions get lost in retrospection. So they do have an effect in the sense that something happens after them that wouldn't happen otherwise. But this thing that happens afterwards often has absolutely no marker or carries no direct connection with that intervention, which comes to the paradoxical point where, which I think it's also a very interesting fact about psychoanalysis. Often the best analyzed people are the ones you don't know who their analysts were from talking to them. Like a very classical sign that somebody was poorly analyzed is if you can see the style of the analyst in their behavior, meaning that the labor of the analyst leaves a mark in the patient. You can see, it might not be like counseling or therapeutic suggestions or whatever, but just a style, something kind of transmits across one to the other, and some trait, some marker is left. Usually, and I think that's actually most of psychoanalysis, interventions leave no mark. You will most likely never hear from a patient a kind of reconstruction of a cause and effect where it's like, you said this, then I realized that's why this thing changed. So it fails sometimes in the game of giving and asking for reasons. You never get to get the full explicit account of how things connected. So that's something weird about it. It all kind of goes back to this idea that you're not so much adding something, but either removing it or allowing an addition to be made from the side of the patient, which is why ultimately when they recount what they went through, they will not include you in that account. right? The reconstruction of cause and effect, which is legitimate, will not include your interventions. And often in descriptions that you get at the end of analysis of what people did, yes, and then my analyst said this, and this like touched on the equivocation of this word. There is a bit of theater to it, a bit of, desire to make a clearer sense in which, like, you're making the case, a kind of praise of interpretation, even though at the time probably you don't even recall it at the time that intervention had that effect. You reconstruct it afterwards because you're trying to show to people that psychoanalysis works. And another thing, which perhaps is the most crucial part, which I kind of like the way I phrase it here, which is that interpretations or interventions, they extract associative resources out of asocial structures in the patient's world. Okay, that's like my definition of what we end up doing, which is people already say things that have connection with many things in their lives. But these connections, they're not integrated to symbolic structures that they share with others, that they are able to maintain when they deal with other people, that they integrate to their identities or whatever. So there is something to what we do that concerns helping these things which do have some structure. They connect a bunch of things in people's lives. It's already there, those connections. But you manage to bring this to the fore a bit, to the point that now it's allowed to make those connections with other things. Previously, you couldn't. And usually things cannot remain the same if you bring that from this sort of structured but kind of invisible underbelly of a person's discourse to a kind of to become a fragment of that discourse in a more explicit way. So there's something associative in the sense that it can connect, it has connections, but it is not existing, and it's allowed to exist, and therefore bring those connections up to this higher socialized space. So there is something to these properties that I find interesting to look for when we're thinking how could we engage, help, contribute to other organizations that might be interested in being heard and discuss their projects with us, other than teaching them about organizational Trinitarianism, or why they should read this or that guy, or carelessly proposing strategic changes to a movement that we're not part of. So that's one thing. And then so there are other effects and other positions we can occupy. So that's a bit what I'm trying to discern. The last thing I wanted to mention here that also concerns this kind of effectivity of listening is that a big contribution that Lacan made that I think is also relevant for us is that at some point he gives this suggestion that, well, it looks like there is a coincidence between the sort of increment or transformation that people can find in analysis and something about the training to become an analyst. And those two things are kind of heading in the same direction, to the point that he will say that the end of analysis is also the passage from analysant to analyst, right? There is something to this which interests me, and I've been studying it for a long time. I've tried to publish a book on it. I didn't try to publish. I published a book that was an attempt at dealing with this, which is that there is a shift, a kind of the proposition of a shift where this idea that, well, there are some things in people's lives that have no place. Psychoanalysis starts by telling people, well, we have the hypothesis that this could get a place, this could be spoken of, lead to new practices in your life, so on and so forth. But it's not just a matter of emptying out the sort of phantasmatic partnership you make when you need to account for these poorly symbolized things and you only have your fantasy to deal with it. It's not just a matter of traversing, emptying out a fantasy. It's also a matter of displacing from this phantasmatic, abstract partnership you have to a real concrete partnership with the analytic community. The other side of saying the end of analysis turns analysants into analysts is also saying that it shifts you from the position of somebody who is speaking to an analyst, but really working through some weird kind of relation to what we call an other, right? This abstract kind of point of reference, to the position where you can actually address some of these singular aspects of your life to a community of people who believe that that thing does have a place, right? So for those interested in the very long, old debates that Zizek has been kind of developing since the 80s, 90s about what did Hegel mean by the community of believers? Do the community of believers in the phenomenology of spirit have anything to do with the analytic community? This would be a reading that kind of solves that problem. It says, oh, yes, sure, it does, but it's yes, the good news is it's true. The bad news is that neither the community of believers nor the analytic community is what Zizek thought it was. So it's kind of mixed result. But again, these things become a bit more clear if you focus on listening rather than on like this big theoretical debates about the death drive and things like that. So the core of this kind of more concrete view and the core of what I'd like to put forward as the concept that helps to make that bridge and helps to make a sort of useful analogy or comparison between psychoanalysis and this organizational approach we've been developing is the concept of transference. That's why I suggested that if anyone wants to read a bit about it, could read Freud's Dynamic of Transference, which is a really beautiful text. But Lacan posits transference as one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. And if you look at the concepts, it kind of stands out right away because the other three concepts, drive, repetition, unconscious, they're all concepts that don't have boundaries. They don't have limits, right? They can apply to anyone at any time. They don't, therefore, have, let's say, a domain of operations, whereas transference does. Even though you can find both in Freud and much less in Lacan, reference to transference as a sort of automatic thing that neurotics do. They transfer, as if it's like what you're doing all the time. Usually, when you see that sort of description in Freud, the way that he's using transference is almost exchangeable with a sort of neurotic identification, which is not the same as transference. So it's not really the core meaning of the concept. Transference is the only concept from the four fundamental concepts that actually coincides with the practice of psychoanalysis, like the entry into establishment of transference, handling of transference, liquidation of transference. If I say these three things, well, I described an analytic procedure with beginning, middle, and end, and with an outside that doesn't concern psychoanalysis. So it has a bit more of reality to it. So I tend to think that that's where we need to start from, rather than start from, being doesn't coincide with itself because the reality is inconsistent, and the name of this non-relation of the one with itself is a death, right? And then, like this metaphysics that philosophy of psychoanalysis sometimes starts from. I rather start, or even like a philosophical anthropology, like humans are neotonic animals. They are born without being totally formed, and that's why language is important, and being in language. Like I rather start from where the practice starts, because that's what we actually have access to. That's where we see if things are effective or not. And transference seems to be the only of these four fundamental concepts that names that. From that perspective, transference is not, and I think that this is where the core idea I wanted to transmit to you guys is, transference is not something the patient does to an analyst, like in the sense of I transfer to you, it's an imputation of a belief. I believe you think this, right? Or I identify with you, I like you, or I see you in this light. Transference is actually, the way that I would describe it is, as I put it here, is a process through which once free association is established, which is a very specific thing, which we need to talk about as well. Once free association is established, which is a kind of impossible imperative we place in patients, patients reproduce a certain affective pattern with their analysts. So it's a pattern that both analyst and analysand are inside of. It's not something that one of the two is outside of, looking from the outside. They reproduce some kind of pattern that has been created elsewhere. That's why it's transferred, right? And actualized in the clinical space. And the common thing between what's happening in the clinical space and what happened when that pattern was established, at least that's the hypothesis, is that that pattern also appeared in a moment where what other people wanted from the patient was unclear. So you don't know what people desire from you, and you come up with strategies to deal with that. Then you find yourself in the highly artificial space where somebody says, yeah, do as you please, like I don't give a shit. Well, if you do as you please, you're doing what I just asked. So you're not doing as you please. And if you try to please me by saying what you think analysts wants to hear, you're doing what you want because I didn't ask you to do that. So there is no way to fulfill that demand, right? When I tell you, be free, we already know, for good or for bad, that's an impossible demand to fulfill. And transference is what you do to respond to that, right? So at this moment of kind of undoing a social bond, I'm telling you, do as you please. Some commitment between us is shaken. People put on top of it a connection that they made somewhere else, right? So transference is not about what an analysant imputes or projects onto the analyst, right? So that's not really the important part, so much as the effective relation that connects them when the concrete connection is missing. So something gets disconnected, you put a connection that was built elsewhere under different premises in that place, right? But you need to consider those two levels at the same time to see what transference is, kind of closing a gap in the social structure. The issue is, for example, in regular life, when there is no artificial conditions, we don't open the space where you're shaking things up and put nothing in its place. There are many normative commitments you have at once. So, for example, if I hire you for a service and you say, I don't want your money. Well, I'm shaking our commitment. You don't know what to expect from me. Not true, because there are like different layers of commitment. They're still there, and you can now latch on to those and say, yeah, he didn't want my money because he wants to feel superior to me because of this and that, so I know how to act. So it's not that easy to pierce through in real, actual life, all these different commitments we have with people, to find yourself in a position where somebody can actually impose on us this very existentialist kind of imperative, like act freely now. Well, if I act freely, I'm not acting freely. And if I act out of necessity, I'm acting freely because nobody told me to act according to that necessity. So what do you do, right? Whatever you do in that situation is very relevant, but it's not a representation. You're not either enacting for me something that is not real, nor are you referring to something in the past. You're doing it then and there. You're actualizing something, right? So this leads us to the distinction. You see, like when you think about transference in this way, as a sort of ersatz relation that you put in place because there is a relation missing there. So you come up with something in its place. You can see the difference between, let's say, this very basic distinction about how you handle transference in psychoanalysis, which is the difference between analyzing transference itself, meaning to make statements, interventions meant to put the analyst out of the place that he was set in that relation and point to the patient that they are transferring that relation. So you're treating me like your father. You're treating me like your mother. That's a statement of that sort. You're putting yourself out of that relation and saying, you're putting me in this place. That's not my place, right? This is different from analyzing from within transference. Analyzing from within transference means that you understand that that relation has established itself there because, let's say, in the language of the patient's world, to be a bit Badiouian, that's the sort of rapport you create if you need to stitch back into the world a point that doesn't offer itself clearly to be part of that world. You don't know what to do there. It's weird what's happening. So how do you behave in such a way that it can be integrated back to your world? So what we ended up doing is putting the patient in a weird trap because somebody comes to us with a kind of consistent structure of how to parse out the world. We create a very messy, weird interaction with no clear normative commitments between us and the patient. And they will cover it up in whatever way they need to keep the world integrated. And in that moment, we're able to see with a bit more of clarity, let's say, what is the patient's language, right? What's the language of the patient's world? Meaning how things are connected with other things. What is relevant? What is irrelevant? What are positions that are meaningful in that patient's world? And what are positions that make no sense, right? So you say, speak freely, and the person goes, yeah, I'm just dumb. I'm afraid you're going to think I'm stupid, and so on. Suddenly you see that, occupying that position, at least the person knows how to operate from there. It doesn't matter if they're suffering, if they feel humiliated. For some reason, that's where they place themselves in that moment, right? So you learn something about what's meaningful, what's significant in their world. So transference, you see, it's not about representing or looking into the patient's speech to find something hidden behind, which is their relations to the world. You actually make that relation happen. It happens in front of you, and it includes you. And that's perhaps the core part of it that I wanted to mention, which is to analyze within transference means to allow yourself to be composed with the patient, right? You're part of the patient's world in that moment. They integrate you in that passive way that you are occupying in your silence. They integrate you to their world. And that's the condition for you to be able to intervene. The dynamics of transference text ends with that exact point. Freud says the whole battle of psychoanalysis is fought on the grounds of transference. This is not because we need people to like us, to love us, to put us in a position of mastery, because transference is the opposite of all those things. It has nothing to do with any of those things. The whole point is that, and this is the last sentence, you cannot slay a person in absence, in effigy. You cannot touch something which is absent, right? His whole point is, if you want to intervene in affective relations of affect, you need to be made of the same thing as the things you want to intervene upon. It's in a certain sense, and I think Christian Dunker, this Brazilian psychoanalyst, made this point. I'm not sure I think he made it explicit, that in a certain sense, psychoanalysis shares the principle with, what's the name of that type of medication that you, homeopathy, how do you say it in English? Homeopathia? Homeopathic theory, yeah. Which is a theory, I mean, it's a form of treatment that the idea is that you need the same principle of the problem to treat the problem, right? You need to compose, I mean, it doesn't matter the quantity. There's some sort of qualitative homogeneity between the thing being treated and the principle of treatment, right? There's something similar in psychoanalysis. Transference has that exact, could be named homeopathy, right? In the sense of the same pathos, the same relation. You need to be in the same relation to be able to intervene. So I think that when you see things from that perspective, you can see that it's very different to intervene in effigy, meaning in absence, to intervene by saying, look, you're going through this and that, you could do this and that. So people are representing a problem, you're representing a solution, you're communicating to them a solution, and they're taking it back to do something about it, right? Sorry, Ander. Sorry. Yeah. See you, Efren. So yeah, where was it? Yeah, so this principle, I mean, it's similar in that how you compose things, meaning how you compose a particular type of what Freud calls love type relation in the clinic, actualized in the clinic, is what makes you commensurate with the unconscious. So it's kind of like you're picked up as part of it. That's why being silent, bringing things up that were there, but kind of in between the lines, is effective, right? If you were just talking to the patient about something that happens elsewhere, you would be just counseling, doing communication with them about their problems elsewhere. But that's not what we do. And the whole theory of our practice is based on this very weird idea that you're not acting on something that happened or something that might happen. You're acting on something that is happening there and there, which is why, if you stop to think about it, if you look at Freud and Lacan, they have totally inverse theories. Lacan was so aware of this somehow that his theory has no history, right? To see a patient as a Lacanian, you don't need to concern yourself with a deep history of, well, this probably happened when they were a kid, and this, and this, and this. Freud, the clinic is like you have a iceberg, and the clinic is on top, and deep history is at the bottom, right? So the clinic is giving you insights into everything that happened in a sort of deep history of individuals. In Lacan, it's kind of the inverse. The clinic is the surface, but everything else is kind of like added garbage that patients add to the story to account for what they cannot but do here and there when they're seeing you. So you see me, it's such a weird, anxious experience to be told to do what you want, that then say, yes, I need to do this because when I was a kid, this and this happened to me and that happened to me. I mean, if you're good, you're probably going to say true things that happened to you. You know, I mean, it's much better way of justifying yourself. But the connections between those things and how you're behaving in the clinical space, that's up to you here and now. That's why Lacan substitutes this deep history for the concept of fantasy, this idea that, well, you come up with a story that connects cause and effect but the core is what's happening here and now. The structure you're listening to is what's happening here and now in clinical space. Is any of this making sense for now? Like, as I said to you guys, I'm not too worried about going very far with the presentation. I'd rather that it makes sense to everyone. And I also know that people asked in our survey for us not to give like ridiculously long presentations. So I'm also willing to divide this into more presentations. Just want to make sure it's making sense, or if anyone has any questions. Yeah, if it's making sense, fine. Okay, I'll continue, but please interrupt me if anything is weird. So this brings us to the point, which is we want to look into this type of practice. The first aspect of it is that the way it intervenes has very how to say, it has very peculiar, very singular, and kind of precious effects and ways of acting that I think we don't find in many places. So it might be interesting for us to look for how to hold on to this analogy if this interests us, because psychoanalysis does show us that we can interact with others in a way that does more than explicate theory. That's not what analysts do to analysts, that have a very strict connection between increasing autonomy in the other and also increasing the other's capacity for heteronomy. So those two things are almost the same, right? In psychoanalysis, the more you listen to yourself, the more your world increases in size, but also your awareness that you're determined by things you can control. Usually there is a very peculiar mixture of being able to, let's say, side with the other's autonomy, while knowing that the cost of this is also siding with their heteronomy, right? Meaning how much they're determined by things they cannot control. And another way of saying this is that, and more, I think this is I'd say this is the core principle of psychoanalysis. People don't like to talk about this very much because we dislike the word, but I think in practice, our commitment is to freedom. I think that's the core of psychoanalysis, but it's just the fact that freedom doesn't happen where consciousness is. So live with that, you know? I mean, you do make free decisions, which is crazy. They just don't happen when you think you're deciding. So that's kind of the problem. But I mean, that's an interesting kind of thing to keep when you're looking for interesting ways to interact with other organizations. I would say there is hope for us. We just cannot enjoy it. Like it's just not for us. There's hope for us, but not for us. Something like that. I don't know. And also, I mean, the core thing for me, which is really a complicated thing when it comes to politics, I think that after the two presentations by Enzo and Victor, I think that it's clear to me, at least, how central this issue is, which is not that many models of emancipation pass the test of applying to others as they apply to yourself. So to talk about the lack of, class consciousness of others rarely comes with a discourse about how that problem affects the organization that is writing the text, right? And to all its faults, because I think that psychoanalysis is actually pretty bad at every other theory of emancipation. I mean, it likes to talk about, totem and taboo and Moses and monotheism, but it's pretty much all its institutions have one guy at the center, many women's working around them and so on. Like, we're not very good at that. But when it comes to the unconscious, you do have like 100 years of a practice that only works if the thing you're postulating to others also is postulated to yourself. So when we say that, which is just an equivalent statement to saying that psychoanalysis is about listening, not about speech, because to listen to others, you must have listened to yourself enough to know where your traps lie, right? If you're not kind of threatened or plagued by the unconscious, you simply won't hear the unconscious anywhere. Those two things are connected. So it only applies to others if it applies to you. So that's, for me, also a fundamental thing that psychoanalysis has to offer. And again, it doesn't appear anywhere in textbooks about, Lenin and the discourse of the analyst, or surplus whatever Marx and Freud and Lacan. But in practice, that's what you're doing. You're going from listening to people back to your analysis, and you're like, fuck, I mixed my problems with that person's problems. Now I need to go back, pay attention to this, and so on. Like, that's where the effort is most of the time, in one way or another. So that seems, when you go back to that ground, the connections to problems we have on the ground of, challenges for politically organizing, things like this, for me, they become a bit clearer. So, but if, let's say, the analogy is interesting, and we do want to ask, okay, what of this is useful or reproducible, or can be kind of re-encountered in other types of connections between, perhaps not people, but organizations. And the problem there, as I said, is that there are restrictions to psychoanalysis that I think we know very little about. And if you don't think about them, when you generalize from analysis to outside, you carry over too many presuppositions you shouldn't. So two things that I like to point out, which I think are crucial, and I more and more think that this is actually quite impressive about psychoanalysis, which is, it's another way of talking about what I said about transference, that you need to be composed into that relation with the patient to be able to intervene in something that's actually happening rather than represented in clinical space, is that despite, first restriction, despite there being all sorts of experiments, and despite there being all sorts of alternative kind of arrangements, psychoanalysis has not abandoned the fact that it is kind of a dual experience, meaning a person who's the analyst, a person who's the analysand in a room. I mean, there are group sessions, there are rotating analyses, there are a bunch of other things. Psychoanalysts will say it's not a dual experience, it's an experience with a third, which is the other, but that's already, the Lacanian bug, who cannot even, we can't even recognize that in some very objective level, there are two people in a room, but there are. And this is crucial because for some reason, we can only treat traumas that have the same structure. So love is at first between two people, and we can only treat traumas at the level of love type relations, of affective relations. So there seems to be an interesting formal connection between the literal clinical setting of two people relating and the type of thing we get to interact with, which also has the structure of being composed by two people. easily composed by two people. No, it can be me and my mom, but my dad gets in the way. It can be me and whoever, but I'm actually addressing a third. It doesn't matter. But if you were to describe the relations there, and if you were to go, back to the source, meaning actual, real existential love for someone else, it's for someone else, right? So there is a connection between a material logic of two people and the fact that the things we get to interact with also have that form. So the thing I said before, that you need to compose, like you need to be dragged into a certain relation, which carries with it a certain language, so that you can use that language to interact and intervene within that space. That's the only way to achieve effectivity, right? To do like a Philippe Julien kind of thing. That's how you kind of get in tune with the propensity of these kind of things that the person is doing. There is a further determination, which is there is a kind of social correlation between a dyadic social relation, which some people might claim is not even a social relation. Two people cannot form a social relation, like in strict terms. You can have like it's an intersubjective, it's whatever, but social kind of implies a bit more. Yes, Francois Julien. What did I say? I mean, who cares, right? It's French. Philippe. Yeah, Philippe Julien is the second one. Sorry. Anyway, but the fact is, there is a correlation between the type of actual relation that we establish with people and the class of phenomena that we get to intervene upon. And I think that, it became clearer for me that there is a correlation that is limited, meaning it's not anything, it's just those things rather than other things that we get to intervene. Because if you look at traumas that have other connotations, other structures, other histories, for example, police violence, state kind of related trauma with dictatorships and things like that, it's not uncommon for people to realize that if you can do personal analysis for 20 years, and then you're called upon the Truth Commission to give testimony of things that happened in the dictatorship, and you feel like the trauma is exactly where it was. You didn't touch it because it doesn't have the form of a diet that you can tell another person and enact with that person a kind of relation that then you can intervene from within. In private clinic, if you tell that some abstract entity, which is called the state, shot your kid, which is actually a more truthful statement than saying that a policeman shot your kid, because if you actually if you meet that policeman who shot by accident your child or on purpose, there's nothing they can say to you that symbolizes what happened, because it's part of the scene that the person had their agency kind of divided between themselves and a larger institution that is paying for the price of what they do in a certain way. So your issue is not with the policeman. Your issue is the policeman, the police force, the state, and other things. If you tell that in analysis, you're not enacting anything about that trauma or anything like this. You're just going to tell it. You're going to represent it. It's going to remain in effigy. It's going to remain in absence. There's nothing we can do in a dyadic setting to actually actualize things like that. Whereas, for example, if you're constantly engaging with an institution, if you are going to a hospital and you're sometimes seen by a doctor, sometimes seen by another doctor, sometimes your analyst is there, sometimes he's not, that person is trapped between being your personal analyst and also representing an institution which is absent but effective in what happens to you. It's much more likely you can actualize in that context the type of relation that concerns the trauma you suffer than if you go to a Lacanian analyst and just talk to them on a couch. And I have empirical evidence, quite substantial, from things that happen in Brazil with clinic of testimony, that this is in fact the case. Sometimes it's better to be seen by a doctor who won't be seen for very long in the public health system, but in a way that your analytic process is cut across by these particular conflicts, but allow you to enact there a certain position. Then if you just go to a private analyst in a private kind of office and try to treat this as if it's just another thing that happened, like being dumped in a relationship, losing a parent, in a accident or something like this. So it's important. This kind of led me to this kind of ongoing research on what I call the institutional efficacy of clinical work, meaning there is a correlation between the type of setting that can compose with the trauma, right, or compose with a certain type of social relation, and what we get to treat and what we don't get to act upon. You can see that this is exactly the point of connection between our theory of organizational trinitarianism, which claims how things are composed affect what you get to interact with and what is intelligible to you, right? And this theory of transference, where there is a material compositional basis to transference that limits what we get to interact with in clinical space, right? And no wonder that I can use for both examples that really cool scene of the really terrible movie I like called John Dies at the End, about this group of friends that finds a door that has no doorknob. It has a ghost doorknob. And then they try to open it and they cannot touch it. And then this girl who is missing a hand, she has like a ghost limb syndrome. With a ghost limb, she can open the ghost door. That's like when it clicked to me, like ghost limbs open ghost doors, physical hands open physical doors, If you have like an institutional fight against state violence, you can open institutional state traumas. If you're man, imagine if they stole that scene from Nagarjuna. That would be crazy. I would love that. I tried to find the scene from the movie online. I couldn't, so it's a pity. So the first thing to realize is that, well, there is a restriction to psychoanalysis. We are in a position with our theory to name that restriction better than I think psychoanalysis is capable of doing. In analysis, we're not interested in talking about those things. Therefore, we can both talk about generalizing. So what would it mean to be composed with certain situations in such a way that you can enact certain relations that in that context will be out of place, but will nevertheless reveal something about the, let's say, organizational language of that situation, right? We can talk about how to generalize that experience beyond the clinical setting while respecting things that only work and only function in the clinical setting, because libidinal attachment, family trauma, those things might have a structure that is proper to the analytic setting and shouldn't be generalized. Therefore, concepts cannot be extracted out of the proper domain. There is an additional kind of research to back this up, which is something I'm doing with another friend here from the STP called Tiago. I'm not sure, I think he's not here today, but Tiago and I are doing work in trying to show that you can rewrite a lot of structural anthropology using the logics of worlds from Badiou's work. And one of the unwanted kind of consequences of this work, by trying to show that a lot of actually, let me do something. A lot of unwarranted consequence of this work that I didn't expect to find, but by the way, guys, are you looking for a corollary in Spinoza's Ethics where he says, it follows that the mind is as more capable of perceiving things adequately, the more it has common properties with other bodies have with its body. Is that the thing we were looking in the Ethics? Because it does sound a bit like this homogeneity principle.
I don't think that was it. It's possible I literally like hallucinated it or something, because I keep trying to find it and I can't find it, but I'll go back and read like as much as I can and like try to see if it's some other text that I got it from. But
yeah, but I mean, I'm always in favor of reinventing the wheel. If we're saying the same thing Spinoza said, even the more reason not to read him, because we already know what he said. So, don't worry anyway. But I just wanted to mention this, like one of the consequences of this research is that it's becoming a bit clearer that one way of describing the sort of social context that gave rise to psychoanalysis, both historically and geographically, is a context where, if you look at what Lévi-Strauss called the atom of kinship, and we're giving it kind of a treatment that sounds a bit like Badiou's theory of the atom, meaning it's the basic social unit for composing together affinity structures to form a consistent whole of a world, right? With the caveat that it's a paraconsistent structure, it's not a classical or intuitionistic world. So the basic atom of paraconsistent social affinity would be something like Lévi-Strauss's theory of the atom of kinship, which is why it's not an atom that just includes consanguinity, blood connections. It also includes connections of marriage and connections which are slightly indeterminate, like the connections with the uncle. So the basic atom of kinship includes people you are very similar to, people you are not similar to, and people who you're not sure if you're similar or not. What we realized is that we can actually tell a story of psychoanalysis emergence by realizing that it emerged at a time where we actually fell short of the atom of kinship. Nuclear families are not families in the sense of Lévi-Strauss. They are before the atom of kinship. They're less than the atom of kinship. They do not have socially, meaning that they are not glued to each other on the basis of some people are inside, some people are outside, and some people are kind of nobody knows exactly where. It takes a further connection to establish where they are. Will your uncle from your mother's side be more like a family member or more like a stranger who is like annoying you in the family? That's kind of poorly stabilized, because what actually glues together families are mechanisms of large-scale social reproduction based on patriarchy, based on reproduction of labor force. So you don't need consistency in family structures. You form smaller groups. You don't form large worlds of affinity. So in that context, people are in a position that they need an additional kind of help or additional kind of space to glue the logic of families together from their own perspectives. That's what fantasy is. So the birth of the other in the Lacanian sense, that something that we need to treat, something that is pathological, something that you can reproduce and enact in analysis because it's kind of out of place, because it concerns when you don't know what is wanted from you in a very precise existential sense. We can actually give a historical and kind of logical account of how it appears and why it appeared, when it appeared, and where it appeared, right? So this also gives us another restriction. Why is psychoanalysis ultimately, to use another language that we've been using in STP a lot, the work of Karatani, why is psychoanalysis ultimately concerned with mode A, with the logic of affinity? It's kind of organically paraconsistent. It's all about the object A, which is neither inside or outside, neither the self nor the other. It's all about mommy, daddy, baby. It's true, even though it's not Oedipal, but it is familial. For any type of family, there would still be for any type of family below the atom of kinship, there would still be psychoanalysis. It explains why societies where these issues are a bit better formed, for good or bad, psychoanalysis doesn't develop without having to enter into any ideas of free speech or any other topics that Elizabeth Rudinesco associates with psychoanalysis, as if it needs democracy to flourish. That's not the case. And it also reveals something more clearly, which is there's good reason why psychoanalysis has nothing to say about the state and about economy, value, labor, those things. Cannot intervene on those things because it is a symptom of how the world of kinship is structured under modern capitalist conditions. Mode A in a capitalist society is structured not as a world, is structured as very sparse, dispersed, inconsistent kind of space, and psychoanalysis appears in that context. So for us who are trying to generalize things, if my hypothesis is useful, not only can we understand why love is, let's say, the privileged place for psychoanalysis. Love, and not in the real existential way. Psychoanalysts don't necessarily, intervene or are aware or have something to say about, romantic love. They do have something to say about the love that is indistinguished, like the sort of general affinity, that's something that exists between strangers, between family members. It's also part of people's relationships, but it's not really the core of it. That's what gets transferred in analysis to analysts. Never like real existential romantic love per se. I mean, if an analyst were to say, yeah, we know that romantic love is artificially created in the clinic under transference, you can know that the person is full of shit, or they never were in love for real any time in their lives, because it's clearly the transferential love is not really like passionate commitment to someone. It's much more like the sort of libidinal circulation of something you don't know where to put, about what others want from you, that does appear in love relationships, but usually the pathological side of it, not the core, right? So I'll stop now, Rafa. So I think that not only do we have, I'm trying to offer at least a certain approach to the clinic that facilitates seeing possible connections on the practical side rather than the theoretical side. We also have tools in the STP to describe the clinical practice as a specific, regional, limited practice with limited effects, even though they are very much real and very much, perhaps you can even account for them a bit better. But we also have the means to, let's say, historicize why this is restricted and generalize or make these analogies or these comparisons or whatever we want to make with a bit of prudence, meaning we don't generalize pretending that organizations have an unconscious or something like this, but you're also still have enough kind of tools to extract nice ideas about what could a practice that connects with other organizations look like if it wants to live up to some of these very general principles of how to intervene when you want to increase the capacity of the other to listen to themselves, not necessarily to give them back what you heard, right? What does it mean to intervene in a context that there is this interesting mix of increasing the other's capacity to deal with heteronomy, but that's also a way of respecting and even reinforcing their autonomy. What does it mean to interact in a way that's also not based on being able to transmit well-formed intellectual ideas to others? And that, which I think is perhaps the core of the motivation for this, implies that you can only intervene if you can compose together with others, meaning mix yourself with other organizations and connect those organizations to a space which is the analogy to an analytic community, which is something like a political movement, right? So I can go into these things in more detail if you guys feel like it, but I thought we can just take a break now and then have an initial debate. Perhaps we can even see if there's a question before a break, or how you guys feel if we should stop, have a break first. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think we could have a break, because if we do a question, it will probably eat the break away.
Yeah,
So
I'm fine. Yeah. So should we take 5-10 minutes and then?
Yeah, I think 5 to 10 is
Okay. Is that okay? Okay. Okay, be right back, guys.
Was a very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. I was thinking that you would hate it because I mean you are my professional. You know, we're actually in it together, so I don't want to offend other fellow professionals, you know,
No,
with crazy ramblings.
And I have a question for you, but I think it's better if we wait people come back, right?
I think it's up to you. If you want, I can. I think people are already coming back, right?
4 minutes have officially passed, so
Yeah, it's up to you. If you want to ask, I think we can. I mean, I can repeat it if others arrive.
That's okay. I
it's
think
recorded.
yeah, it's recorded. Yeah, I think it was a great presentation, and I think you what you're working really connects with things I'm working and thinking, and I've been working also with Rafael here, and I think I would like to know from you what you think about this aspect of the school of psychoanalysis. I don't know if you're talking about the school of psychoanalysis about this community of psychoanalysis, but I think that there is an interesting thing when you think that when you think in terms of transference and how you put it, that transference is a form of social bond that you do not expect mastery of the other, and you some kind of interpretation, as you said, you like make some cut in this kind of relation where someone how can I say, puts in your image these relations that they have with their parents, their mothers, and etc. But I'd like to know when you think about Lacan's 17th seminary, he says that this kind of relation creates a new social bond, right? The analytic discourse. And I've been working in my school of psychoanalysis in a line in which we think that this new social bond is what makes Lacan think about the true meaning of a school as a community of psychoanalysts, right? And I'd like to know from you if you think that this kind of, and I think personally that this kind of social bonds that create is Lacan's way of thinking how psychoanalysis come to a political issue, right? And I'd like to know from you what you think of this term of the school, the Lacanian school, as a form of organization, as a new form of organization, a new form of social bond, in which people, as I've been working with Rafael, people start with a premise that, may I say, things will not work. And since things will not work, as sexual relation does not exist, we can actually, as we how can I say, derruba, as we follow this ideal of a perfect social bond, a social bond that really connects people, we can effectively create something new. We can effectively make a social bond that is not based on a master, on some sort of relations that establish themselves in a form of certain powers and etc. Sorry, my English. Sorry.
No, but I understand what you're saying. Yes, no.
It's something that
also, I mean, I think we should.
Like
can I just say something? I also think we should establish a try. I mean, it's hard, but to try to have, like, to make it regular in STP, that if anyone wants to ask the question, for example, in Portuguese, it's not a problem at all. I mean, we can translate it You know, like it should be more common, you know, like we never do this, but we should. So it's just something to think about. But I totally understood what you said. Like, I don't think you're a case of somebody who might need that, but
complex things and express them in English sometimes.
Yeah, no, you made total sense, but
okay.
Perhaps everyone could ask their questions, then I go through them rather than going one by one, or should I answer?
I don't know if my question is strictly related to Bruno, so I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just answer him before we move along then. I think I can give a easy answer to that, Bruno, which is I would say that my proposal, my suggestion, which I think it's actually quite kind of down to earth, even though it's a bit counterintuitive, is that there is a very small contribution Lacan made to something that includes more than two people at once, which is just the statement, well, maybe when you end analysis, you can become an analyst, and there might be a different type of procedure that includes other people to evaluate that. That's, to me, the extent of Lacan's contribution to anything that is outside of the clinic. Like everything else, I take with a grain of salt, because he was a vain guy talking to bright political students, and he wanted to seduce those people. And he wanted to say he had a contribution to make to political life. And I don't know, I mean, things that Lacan said that I've never used, man, like I'm embarrassed to admit this in some places, but I don't know what to do with half of Lacan's theory. Like perhaps I'm just a bad analyst, but I just have the feeling that parts of it are solving other problems that concern his philosophical ambitions and other things. And I think that the very stupid fact that this guy founded an institution and then thought that you could dissolve as an individual an institution shows that he doesn't know much about how institutions work. Like, you know, like how do you create something collective and then think, okay, I don't like it anymore, it should be dissolved? Or, you know, write a text with like very complex language to say something happened that now we look like a union or like a juridical sector, and we no longer look like an analytic group, as if like that came from the outside and not from how things are run. You know, like he's not very good or experienced or savvy with organization. So I have questions about the usefulness of these late ideas. I mean, so that's the first point. Like, I think that I would take with a grain of salt the set of contributions that we usually call the political Lacan: discourse theory, analytic discourse, the new social bond that psychoanalysis brings about. And I would do it for two reasons. First, I don't know how to use it in clinical space. Second, most of the places that should exemplify how those ideas are good, they're not run in accordance with those ideas. There's a big difference between a very conservative institution run by well-analyzed people and a different institution. Those are not the same thing. And I think Lacanian schools are usually, they have a healthy doses of relief, you know, of some ideals. They're a bit more, I mean, it is sometimes very nice to be there and to see like, okay, things are run more smoothly, a bit less neuroses, but that's because people did analysis. It's not because the institution has an interesting format. You know, it's really bad at thematizing labor issues, equality issues, power issues. It's still structured like, you know, it's like Trotsky's groups dividing infinitely. Like we're not no better than that. So if we cannot use it for anything, how good is it? Like why are we exporting the product we're not, you know, even wanting to try? So I have an issue with that. So I do think that we can actually explain this with the theory I propose, because when it comes to libidinal attachments of dyadic form, we get to enact that in the clinic. We get to elaborate that for real. Whereas institutional relations, we don't touch those things. So the moment that you are allowed to freely create an institution, you will reproduce patterns from elsewhere. And the middle-class bourgeoisie will reproduce middle-class bourgeoisie patterns in these Lacanian institutions, which is exactly what they are, even though the individuals think differently than that. right? They're better analyzed as individuals, but they reproduce at the collective level a very ordinary type of institution. It's less intense in that reproduction because people are less, let's say, demanding of the institution, but the institutional form is very ordinary. So I don't want to dismiss the merits of engaging with organizations with less libidinal intensity sometimes. I think Lacanian schools are a good example, but I don't think that we're near of scratching the surface of why, the actual domain of analytic efficacy is so much smaller than what it professes to be. I think we're still trying to get to that, which is why I'd rather look for our analogies, our comparisons, or points of, okay, is this useful in any way? At the part where we are efficacious in day-to-day life, rather than the part that we are, trying to make ourselves relevant to be part of the conversation, but, people are moving on and realizing that sometimes we're not that efficacious, which is something to consider. Does it make sense? Like, that's kind of my position.
Thank you. We have to talk more about this.
Also, can I just make one statement which is about something symptomatic? Did you realize that every discourse in Lacan, it has a different scale? Like master's discourse, well, it's based on like feudal societies, like large scale social structure. University discourse, well, institutions, right? University. Then hysterics discourse is already, it's a good one, but it's smaller. Analytic discourse, it has two people. So like when even in the discourse theory, they're like the bad ones are large scale and the good ones are small scale. So I don't know, I've never heard anyone talk about that, and I find that it's symptomatic of what I'm saying. Haf, I think you had your hand up second.
Okay. Yeah. So it was a very good presentation, even if you withheld from us your diagrammatic abilities, but I'll forgive you for that, especially because I think the transference dynamics that you sketched out would be really interesting to see what would come up. But there are two things that I was thinking, and in a sense they may seem too outside what we are talking, but I'm trying to think them by problems that I think we've had, and we, like every one of us involved in these types of practices, but problems that I think come up in organizational structures and when political stakes are hand, etc. So the first thing I was thinking is, it seems that like there's this strange division, because like the history of psychoanalysis, as you pointed out, psychoanalytical discourse develops itself when, as you were saying, the nuclear family is in a sense broken off from the affinity structures and the more complex social structure. So in a sense, it seems like it's like, okay, this is like something that's under the social structure in a sense before. I mean, I don't know the topological directions. There's a lot of category friends here. They can stitch this up better. And it seems like it's curious. And I was thinking a lot of Michael here, because the imagined communities, they seem to also arrive at the same moment, in a sense that maybe they have a bit longer history, but it does seem that it's like the supplement of this breaking off, because if the Freudian family problems are like under the structures of affinity, the national community problems, they seem to be over. And what I was asking is if you think this makes sense, because what I was thinking is that I think a lot of the problems, or some of the problems that I encountered, they seem to make a lot more sense if like these problems appear unconnected and there's like a broken link in them, and you try to deal with them separately. I mean, there are the interpersonal problems that you're like, oh, we have to get along, we have to speak, and we have like, there are a bundle of strategies for working with that problem. And then there are also like parallel strategies, but I don't think they are always integrated or worked through together, which seem to deal with the imagined community of an organization. I mean, I think, of course, an imagined community is not the same as an imagined nation, but I think there are like these problems when the structures of affinity are not brought to the fore in a sense, or they are not working. It seems that like there's these two splinters that appear. I mean, and the problems, you are dealing with the problems, but maybe you are dealing separately, and that some organizational pathologies may develop in this space. I don't know. This was just something that came up to me when I was listening to you.
Yeah, I think
like,
that
this is not a question. This is just an opinion.
The commentary guy at a conference. But I do think that, I mean, there are 2 points in what you said that 3 points in what you said I'd like to briefly mention. One is that I didn't go into this today, but the cool thing we could get to at some point is that the description we just gave of transference, as you need to stitch yourself together to a certain world, to be decomposed in such a way that from the standpoint of that relation, a bunch of other things that you're connected now to appear, right? So you're in transference with that person, that gives a kind of privileged perspective on the person's kind of general world. Well, that's pretty much formally kind of what we did with our theory of the money form in the primer. So we did want to suggest in the primer, right, that we want to account for the logic of value, money, as a kind of construction of something that has something like a universal property, right? It's able to relate to a whole class of objects in a special way, because it is composed in a certain sense, right? So the whole theory that we try to show is that because money is homomeric in the sense that it relates to its parts without changing its quality, that the inner relation of money to itself can express the relation between two commodities to themselves, right? So you need to compose an object, like you're building a sensor of a certain type, so that you can sense differences of a particular kind. Well, the general theory of that, which is based on what we call organizational Trinitarianism, claims that to compose things in a certain way makes some things intelligible and allow you to interact with some things. So the basic framework would allow us to explain how transference works and why it only works in those contexts, and why money works, like why it can acquire certain properties that it has, that you can only see the social space from the standpoint of money. Like when you're a money bearer, the money sees relations, you don't see the relations, right? They appear to money. So we can actually kind of start bringing these things together, and we are ultimately looking for a way to talk about organizations where, for example, the following situation could be possible, which in my opinion is a possible reading of how Marx describes the communist movement in the Communist Manifesto, which is to say, remember when he says, well, the communists are the most advanced, blah, 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 part of every social movement. They are not, don't have specific rules, specific parties, specific banners, whatever, right? Well, one way of thinking about that is that you have all these dispersed movements that are somehow connected, but in an implicit, unworked out way. You add something to them that, because it is composed like them, you can then see what they have in common more clearly. Well, that has the same structure of what we're calling transference, what we're calling money. So things started to sound similar while remaining with their separate properties. So I didn't go into the diagrammatic part, but part of that is because we already did it. So that's that. The other point that I would like to make, just to conclude, is that I don't think psychoanalysis deals with social relations proper. For me, like, I like to think social relations as something where I relate to you under the presupposition that you relate to other people. Like, there is no dyadic social relation. That's too small to be a social relation. That it doesn't have enough kind of how to put this, like patches for other things to glue into. It's below the social, right? No wonder that usually dyadic things are very interesting to produce novelties, like you and an object, you and your thought, because it's too little, so it's a bit looser and inconsistent or whatever. So I think that psychoanalysis happened at a weird subsocial level, right? So it doesn't deal with family. It cannot change family structures. It can only intervene at this additional thing people create in order to stitch together familial and relations of affinity and so on. So it's below the social. And what I really like is usually what we do is that we start with analytic concepts and then we try to blow them up. But what you realize when you try to kind of, it's like a very low resolution bitmap file, and you try to like make it really big and it becomes all grainy. It's much better when you have a high resolution big file and you try to make it smaller. You lose information in the process, but it works. And I think that what we are doing works in that way. Our theory of mode A with B and C, paraconsistency, kinship structure, so on, it's meant to be applied at a larger scale than psychoanalysis acts. Then under certain conditions, it's bottlenecked all the way to the individual. That's part of the problem, right? In modern societies, individuals are left to solve a problem of patching up together these things with individual myths, which are in themselves a paradox. There's no such thing as an individual myth. It makes no sense. For me, it's like people who say, let's start making myths. Like, to make a myth or to have an individual myth, it's a paradox. It makes no sense. It's just a contradiction. You don't make a myth. If you make a myth, it's not a myth, because myths don't have origin. Like somebody invented a story that's not a myth, right? So you're left with this impossible task of gluing these things together. But that's like you take it, because we took very large categories that deal with very complex, higher order problems, and you bottleneck them to the level of individual practices. That's why it becomes distorted. That's why you need to talk about divided subjects as if people have two halves. Like all images start becoming like kind of crappy. And half of analytic metaphysics comes from crappy images that you bottlenecked into this small scale where it's not their origin. When you bring them back to their proper sphere, which is social, organizational, blah, 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 things become much more easy to understand. Like they are more obvious, the connections between things. So I think that that's very useful. And the last point, which is something that we already mentioned, but the gluing of these 3 points we haven't done yet, which is that in the same theory that we're developing of how is the logic of kinship, affinity transformed under capitalist conditions, Michael, especially, he's working on his PhD on this topic. One of the things we're developing is the thesis that the very idea that community logic is about inside and outside, like Carl Schmitt's kind of approach, that's part of the pathology. That's part of the ideology, because essentially community logic is paraconsistent. You have inside, outside, and things that are neither here nor there, and those things are the things that really make communities work. So it is under the condition of nation state, private companies, corporations, law, meaning it's once you need to project this intuitionistic and classical logic onto, right, it over-determines the space of affinity, that you kind of carve out classical structures out of affinity worlds, and that's how nations are. Nation states are more classical. It's like you carve out of a paraconsistent logic a classic structure inside and outside, right? Even though the logic itself allowed for more than that. So I think a nice insight we had is that this is how you account for the modern origin of populism and nationalism. Nationalism, you take this kind of trivalent logic of inside, outside, and neither here nor there. If you take just the inside and outside, you get nationalism. If you take just the neither here nor there, you get populism. So you uncouple the two, because that's the only way to make large-scale communities under capitalist and state-like conditions. You need to abide to these logical structures, right? So we have a theory of how this kind of paraconsistent space gets overdetermined by state and capital logic under modern conditions. And what I'm trying to develop with this crazy thing I'm telling you guys is that we can also track how this paraconsistent structure gets kind of entangled into a sub-social logic, which you call fantasy, unconscious, libidinal, blah, 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 right? And this sort of formation of groups, formation of, church, army, this whole Freudian theory of groups kind of structure, how these two things, how you can track this on the large scale and the small scale. So how we connect these things, I think is a bit unclear yet. But I think that we can tell that story. I think we're starting to tell it, which is pretty cool. I mean, that we can pull all those things together in the same kind of minimal explanation. I think it's pretty wild.
So if I could start by replying to also what you said about the myth thing, I think I would disagree insofar as we can make myths only by accident, which is something that Molly Ann Rothenberg actually talks about in her book, The Excessive Subject. I don't know if you've read that. I know that she's written a little bit on your work actually, but she has this great discussion of Julius Caesar, this whole connection about how the ways that historical sort of myths end up becoming or modern myths or whatever come into being. It's not because people plan them out a certain way, but because they go wrong in precisely such a way that it becomes mythologized. But
yeah, but I think that agrees with what I said. Like, it's not like you can make them on purpose or that you can have an individual myth, right? That what you just said is neither one of those two things.
I don't know. I mean, well, okay, yes. Yes, but also not yes. So what I'm going to get into with the question is kind of related.
Okay.
So this got me thinking about, I'm so interested in this question of the dissolution of the transference, and especially this, it has this very Platonic image, it's like Plato's cave image for me, where it's sort of you're fighting with these shadows in the space of your fantasy or whatever. And then when the transference dissolves, it's kind of you get to step out of the cave, into the analytic community, right? It's not the forms are so much whatever, but it's actually having to do the work of building that organization or that community or whatever out of, rather than sort of being trapped within the symptom or the fantasy or something. And what I was also kind of thinking about with this is I think there are actually different ways to approach the resolution of this problem. This keeps coming up in conversations I've been having. I have this one friend who's a Foucaultian Marxist who's sort of focused on different approaches to the state and policy and reform and stuff like that. And we've been having a lot of these conversations about the difference between putting emphasis on politics versus putting emphasis on techniques, and what is the difference between these things. And I was getting really into some of the stuff by Alvaro Garcia Linera, the guy who was vice president of Bolivia and does all that really interesting political theory stuff, where I really like the way that he emphasizes this question of, if you have a socialist state power, to what extent is the socialist state power actually going to be able to make reforms in an intentional way that accomplish what people want, and how much does it kind of have to get out of the way and help bottom up movements form? And I think this is a really important sort of question or issue for people to discuss. And I noticed that I think a lot of the distinction that I see in different sorts of discourses that put emphasis on politics or techniques, and especially a lot of the sort of maybe more what's the word I'm looking for, more complementary frameworks, but also some of the disagreements that form within those frameworks. I think you could argue that putting some of the stress on something like organizational analysis would be similar to this idea of having a state that kind of gets out of the way and helps, some kind of bottom up or form of life develop out of that, rather than kind of telling it what to do. But it's still kind of, trying to do that from that perspective of being political or being in the position of the state or something, right? But I feel you can also look at it from the other direction. You can look at it from the direction of what the people actually do in that bottom up process, when the state gets out of the way. And I'm starting to think that's actually more the space of techniques and what Simondon worked on and all of that stuff that I've been trying to incorporate more into the project that I'm approaching, where it's kind of it's similar to where like on the one hand, there's this problem of getting out of the way for people to like discover their stuff. And then there's like what you actually discover, like once people get out of the way to like let you discover those things, you know? And I feel like this is also kind of like the cybernetics psychoanalysis relation, maybe you could say, or it's like a lot of the emphasis on cybernetics is like having the sort of positive like organization of communities. Whereas like I feel like psychoanalysis, it's kind of like, you know, almost this approach to management that is rather than like facilitating that kind of positive structure, it's like the kind of negative of like how to step out of the way for that kind of thing to even take shape in the first place. And this does come back to this problem of like, to what extent does it make sense to try to help give people ideas or answers to problems? And to what extent is it a matter of like situating yourself in the transference and sort of helping people like take responsibility for how they dissolve it? Because Stafford Beer does have this whole thing where he critiques what he calls like command control management structures, which like, I think there are two different ways to critique it. Like, I think there's the sense in which you can critique it where it's like by getting out of the way. There's also this way of sort of critiquing it by like being like an example of what happens when someone gets out of the way and lets you do your thing. Like, I think you can kind of do it from both angles. And I'm really curious about like the extent to which that kind of organizational analysis can like account for, I guess, what I'm trying to frame, and I might even be like totally misguided. What I'm like trying to see is like, I guess, both sides of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, so to go from parts, just to start with the last thing you said, I don't think we're discussing here a model for doing things in general. I'm interested in like, given the particular thing we're doing and the particular type of encounter that has happened, right? People coming to us and saying, I want to talk to you guys about what we're doing in this occupation. Like, what is the sort of thing we can do in that context, right? With the stuff that we are developing that's coherent with what we've been developing. So that's for me the conditions of what I'm saying. Whereas, let's say, though actually, Linera knows of our work, and perhaps in the future we can even get him to join us for a meeting or something. But like when you take like a very complex problem as the relation of autonomous indigenous movements in Bolivia and the role of the state, I mean, such a complicated question that even though you could perhaps imagine that, the issue, I mean, definitely the general issue of what does it mean to support an autonomous movement? What is the role of a state that cannot be dissolved because it has too much power, and that would be both impossible and kind of stupid to let go of that power in a conjuncture where we're so weak, but at the same time to put it to a use that doesn't kind of suffocate the autonomy of indigenous movements and subaltern communities in Bolivia. Like, I think the general topic of autonomy, heteronomy, getting out of the way makes sense for that discussion, but I wouldn't even know where to begin to talk about the topic. It's so complicated. Like, what I do think that like just thinking about our particular context, which is smaller stakes, right? I think that, for example, it wouldn't be impossible to come up with some conclusions, some hypotheses about what I said in terms of, well, so perhaps rather than meeting up to discuss theory, discuss strategy, we could come up with projects that we do together that are useless to those organizations, but because they are useless, there are also places where aspects of their organizing logic will emerge in act, just like in transference. And we get a chance of, let's say, helping people model those dimensions of their organizations to themselves by being connected to them. And because we are only doing this because we have a commitment to the communist cause, by integrating us, this partial object, it's partial organization, right? We're organization without a purpose, to their organization for a little moment, we also connect them to this larger thing, which is no longer, an immaterial, imagined connection to revolution, but actual connection with more organizations. So, like, that's a hypothesis with a concrete plan we could try out. That's where that's as far as I think I can go, like in terms of proposing and answering things. But I definitely think that, I mean, the connection with these broad themes of autonomy, things like that make total sense to me. This connects with the issue of psychoanalysis and cybernetics and things like this. I didn't use any big kind of graphs to Raphael's sadness, but I do have here a little triangle, right, with composition, intelligibility, and interaction. And one thing that we've done recently, which I think was a bit cheeky, but also kind of correct, in my opinion, is that we try to make a distinction which goes something like this, that in the 20th century, we've seen 3 big attempts to think social phenomena or social structure in general, right? One of them focused on what differences make up other differences and what differences make a difference, meaning they focused on composition and intelligibility, but kind of couldn't really think action, interaction, and change. That was structuralism. So structuralism kind of goes here. I wish I could put this in another color just so we can make this nice and pretty. Here you go. We do know another movement that tried to think composition and interaction, but the issue of intelligibility, modeling, information wasn't really the core, which is general systems theory, goes here. And in my opinion, cybernetics goes here. It's a theory of interaction and information, but it's kind of poor on the compositional side. It's not really good on mereology. It's not really good on the topological side of things. It's not really good on conditioning information on composition. So cybernetics for me goes here. Of course, with no ambition at all, we're claiming that we are here, right? That we're trying to bridge these 3 things together. So it makes sense that they are connected somehow. Secondly, another thing that I think connects with this story is that we also know of 3 different kind of preferred kind of forms of accounting, forms of dealing with organizations or world or social worlds, if you will, right? One is ethnography, right? Which is very much kind of, let's put it in another color again, guys, sorry. I mean, this is a contribution mostly from discussions with Raphael and Raphael's own. It was this second try was used by Raphael to stun Marcelo when he was presenting on militant inquiries. So we can also say that there is, let's say, ethnography kind of privileges how people compose themselves into families, into structures, to power relations in societies, and what is important to them, what's intelligible, how they account for their worlds, their myths, their stories, and so on. And it has a big problem with how it interacts with this. Should it disappear from sight? Did it distort its explanations, right? Political analysis kind of goes here, right? It is very much concerned with giving a picture of a totality, like this is how things are structured in order for us to interact with it, right? It's mostly concerned with, let's make this point of intervention clear, accessible, and people agree on it, and let's intervene. But the issue of composition, for example, exactly as we were seeing in the last couple of meetings, how workers are also militants, militants are workers, even though you're addressing others, you also need a theory of emancipation that includes yourself in it. How do you connect these things? Problems of autonomy of the other, right? These sort of issues are poorly positioned in this type of political text. And finally, psychoanalytic literature, which goes from case studies to the actual kind of listening of patients in a certain sense. It kind of privileges this pole. As we saw with transference, it's very much concerned with composing, being inside the composition, and it wants to intervene, but it has a big problem with how you transmit psychoanalysis, what is analytic theory, what is a proper relation to formal consistency and things like this. So it doesn't know how to explain these things very well. And again, we're trying to mix these three things together, right? So just to say that I think that we are circulating things like cybernetics. We are, let's say, there is all these things are associating themselves, and I think we are very ambitiously placing ourselves at the position of, no, we want to account for all these things at the same time, rather than having to choose 2 by 2 formal approaches and kind of almost ethical relations to the world of others, right? This could be said to be 3 ethical relations to the world of others, perhaps. As for the dissolution of fantasy, just to conclude, I really have a problem. I mean, I was in love with this when I started reading Zizek, right? The whole traversal of fantasy and the end of analysis. It seemed like this is the core if you want to make a political contribution, right? It's you go beyond something, beyond ideology, beyond some commitment, beyond the shadows, beyond the semblance. But there is a problem with that, which again, real analytic practice shows it doesn't work like that, because we enter analytic communities early on in our analysis. Like, you don't need to end your analysis to become an analyst. You don't need to traverse a fantasy to have analytic practice. So how do you account for that in that model, right? Is everyone a crappy analyst up to that point? So I think that there is a bit of elitism and a bit of unthought kind of aristocracy of psychoanalysis in the Lacan's proposal taken up by Miller, and then kind of thought as a sort of linear development by Zizek of going towards this thing. Freud said that people can start analyzing the moment they can use their own analysis as material to think about the unconscious. Like, that doesn't need much long to happen. What does happen, and I think it's a weird, I like that it has like a Stephen Wolfram kind of overtone, even though I think he's Lex Luthor. But what I like about the other approach, which is that there is some sort of computational, like there's some sort of complexity equivalence. If you went with your analysis up to a certain point, usually you can only take other people's analysis up to that point. It's very hard to analyze people more than you were analyzed. But that only means that, you know, you can take this journey all to a certain point, and then it stops. It's going to run out of steam at that point. Doesn't mean you need to wait until you're fully analyzed, whatever that means, to carry out an analysis with someone else, right? So there's a whole different way of approaching this topic, which is much more, integrates from the get-go the role of the analytic community or the socialization of the unconscious, that you don't need to wait to the end, right, to think about it, which is also why it perhaps doesn't fit very well with the kind of ascension and descendant process, at least in the classic way of reading the cave in Plato. But yeah, I mean, there is something to this where, I mean, ultimately, I think it's connected to I mean, Plato is right, but the image itself for the analytic process, that's probably, I'd rather say that the myth of the cave applies to psychoanalysis as a whole rather than to individual cases. I don't think it applies, like, you don't get out of the cave after analysis, like, it makes no sense. So I don't know. There's something there that I would complicate a bit, and that's why I don't think using that idea of traversing fantasy, the solution of fantasy, is that good of a place to make connections with political practice. I think that the very basic of actual analytic practice is much more interesting, much more fruitful than we give it credence as the basis to make those connections. You know. I'm not sure if it made sense. Just this thing, like, and on the Simondon thing about techniques and so on, there are some things I still don't, I'm not sure. Sorry, Mark, I'm reading your comments. You said kind of the. Yeah, definitely. I mean, to my in Portuguese you say pulling the fish towards you, puxando sardinha para você, pulling the sardine towards yourself, like to my own benefit, right? He only mentioned this anecdote because like we were exchanging things about my book. I don't think that he used to mention this before. So I do think that he was a bit, I mean, I might be overstepping it, but I do think that he suddenly had to stop and think, oh, okay, there is this other thing, which he's way too honest to disregard. You know, he's ridiculously honest guy. So if something's brought to his attention, he takes it seriously. Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry. I hate this, but of course I take some pleasure in it. Yeah, I think that it was written in the preface for my book. But I agree. Yes, I think that he was pointing exactly to this thing. There is there is this dimension, and we haven't worked through it in psychoanalysis itself. So we should be careful not to import it back to politics, where we have better tools than psychoanalysis to point that out. You know, I do think that there is like there is a nice kind of, you know, Badiou had this idea that, you know, psychoanalysis, if Lacan is right, he was a bit like Lenin. If Freud was like Marx, and then Badiou says, well, then Jacques-Alain Miller is like Stalin. And we haven't had like a Mao Zedong of psychoanalysis. And what we're trying to do here could be a bit, you know, it has a bit of a Maoist, like a little cultural revolution-y thing to it, you know, where you're shifting the emphasis from, you know, overemphasizing a sort of inner autonomization of the process in the hands of the analysts and so on. But it's a bit too speculative. But yeah, I just wanted to say that on the point of technique and techniques in Simondon's sense, and where I do feel like it has traction, though I have a hard time. I mean, I know you're saying something more specific than that because it's Simondon, even though the uses of Simondon often in politics, in my opinion, like I think that we are, my own prejudice, just putting it out there on the table, I think we are living in a moment where theorists are so afraid of people that they rather make community with other animals or with machines before they meet their neighbors, you know. So like if you can do a multi-species cosmic connection, or if you can, you know, alienate yourself in the virtual worlds of, you know, the technical objects of the world, it seems somehow easier and more revolutionary than like old meetings and things like that. So I rather get to that once we solve the meeting problem first. But I know that that's not what you're heading, but I do think sometimes overemphasis on the technique worries me, when I still personally think that the main problems concern social relations between people. I do think that one of the things I wanted to get to, not getting to it today, but if you generalize what I'm saying, and you do it kind of rigorously, what you arrive at is the fact that psychoanalysis is mediated by speech, because speech is, let's say, very, it's a medium that is very attuned to the logic of mode A. Oral transmission and the paradoxes of orality and speaking, they are very connected to paraconsistency in a way that writing is more classical, regardless of what Derrida thought, and techniques and technical objects are more intuitionistic. So there is, let's say, if you generalize psychoanalysis, you would need to work through the complex composition of three mediums: speech, writing, and technical objects, right? I do think that in that sense, in that regard, technical objects are definitely something we need to be clear that social relations can reproduce and pass through them more than through people, blah, 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 blah. But when it comes to like hardcore political arguments about free association and so on, I'm a bit skeptical that the question of techniques packs that much punch, you know, or opens that much. But it's just like a side comment, and I just remembered it because it connected with that point that I didn't get to make today.
Can I just quickly ask my question?
Please.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering your thoughts on because I like everything you said about analyzing within transference, and I feel like from the STP standpoint, we're always looking at things pro-compositionally. So like anything that increases the capacity to compose with something else is generally regarded as good by us. But I wonder your thoughts on this. Seems like for Freud and Lacan, it's also similar, right? Listening seems to increase your, if you learn to listen properly, then you actually increase your capacity to compose with others. And so that's where the importance of the community of analysts for Lacan is. And then even in Freud, you see this, like anything that's like introversion or inhibition, anything that's pulling you away from composition is generally like bad. So I wonder if pro-composition is the north star of psychoanalysis in some sense. How does that, first of all, do you agree with that? And also, how does that map onto organizational analysis? Like, what does it mean to be pro-compositional? If we're, let's say, STP trying to help another organization, how do we point them towards that? And like, it seems like a whole field of questions there.
Yeah, as I said, I think that first of all, I think this question goes straight to the core of the matter, and I think that it's also really good one to point to why, when you leave this sub-social, poorly compressed, patched up space that we have right now, which is psychoanalysis, back to the slightly higher space where I think the category of subject is at home. It's much better category for talking about slightly larger collective projects that involve either objects connecting to each other, people, scientific communities, whatever, than like an individual and their inner life, right? This is where I think it becomes clear as well, because psychoanalysts have a really, really bad problem of dealing with concepts of health and cure, because again, it becomes clear when we go back to the practice. To actually practice psychoanalysis, you're obliged, and it doesn't work if you don't do this, if you don't suspend to some degree your desire and your considerations about what is good for the patient. You need to kind of place yourself in a position where you don't know beforehand what is good and what is bad. Things that make people suffer might be the best they can do, and letting that go is going to make them more harm than good. So there is this whole idea that psychoanalysis represents a critique of the good, right? And that we are all about showing that sometimes going towards the good is actually being very Sadian and whatever, even though almost nobody uses that in clinical practice. Like Lacan's point about, the clinical point behind Kant and Sade was a point about, don't trust too much your moral instincts, and look at how people are actually, the actual dynamics of people's relations. Like that's the relevant part. You can be saying something that has a moral content, but behaving like a subjective instrument. And that's what you should be focusing on, not the content of what they're saying, which is the same point we make all the time. Everything else about the critique of the good as such, like our position about philosophy, I think it's much secondary. And when we bring it back to our question here, it's much more at home, the question. I do think that we've been arguing slowly, though I think that sometimes we don't realize how serious that argument is. Like the same way that we're doing this, for example, with the modes, we've been currently working on the thesis that you don't need to know, I can define affinity, value, and property out of a logical characteristic of different logical spaces. There's some emptying out of the content of those notions to keep just the dynamic or the logic of it. And I think there's something similar that we're doing in a more political sense when we say yeah, there is something about composition and connecting organizations together and fostering normative principles that make the world appear in different ways, that you don't need to ask the question, is this good or bad? Is this, right wing or left wing? Because if it is doing that in practice, then it is good, right? I mean, it's both a way of doing what psychoanalysis is asking you to do, kind of suspending your judgment based on what people are saying and based on the images that cross your mind when you hear what people are saying. Well, they tell me they are leftists, so that's good. Lacan would say, yeah, you cannot tell because, something else is happening. Yeah, it's true. It's possible. You should listen rather than assume. But we're also saying that at that level where, there is potential for building up worlds, larger worlds, smaller worlds, undoing worlds, restricting possibilities, and so on, you can kind of associate, you can kind of say something, a bit more prescriptive without undoing the autonomy of the things you're involved. I mean, otherwise you couldn't call yourself a communist. So I think that from our perspective, we can go back and look at psychoanalysis and say, isn't it kind of the case that you guys are, ultimately worried about freedom, worried about, the capacity of people to engage with otherness? And I mean, it is exactly this point, right? What I suggested to you today is that listening is how we integrate new parts into a world, new multiples into a world, rather than speaking, right? You can speak about things and speak so that they don't appear, right? Speak them out of existence, so to speak. Where that's not the case with listening. You cannot listen things out of existence, right? They need to exist if you heard them. And that's even Freud's theory for the ego. It only exists once you listen to yourself, right? That's why you need to speak some things so that they get recorded in your own psychic apparatus as memories rather than thoughts, right? So even in Freud, the individual subjectivity itself is a problem of listening, not a problem only of speaking. So I do think that from our perspective, this might be a thesis, right? That perhaps the core analytic concern is with allowing people to have larger worlds in a sense where large is very hard to define. I think that, it wouldn't be like there are 3 things in my world, now there are 4. I mean, there's everything fits in your world all the time, and you still can tell apart smaller and larger in another more complicated, more, large cardinality kind of sense. But I do think that it's a common principle but doesn't it seem more at home in what we are talking about than in the clinic, right? Where, because the practical principle has to do with suspending a certain normative criteria, you never get to assume that you do have a normative criteria, because what's the other place you have to claim that you're concerned with this? The place where you suspend is also the place where you should claim it. So you're stuck. Whereas in larger organizations, individuals can claim it. I can say, yes, I'm concerned with communism, whereas as an organization, we suspend certain judgments and don't act in a certain way. So it's much more easy to deal with divided subjectivity when you have organized and organizations than when organized are parts of a body, of an individual human body, and the organization is the human individual. I think it's really a matter of, again, bottlenecking this logic to a human subject. Like, it's too small to actually be able to unfold everything that's at stake. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's how I would think it. And I do think that ultimately this is a big issue that we're still working through, right? For our sake, are we satisfied, or are we at least kind of happy with the direction where we claim that rather than listening to what you're saying and trusting just what a representative is saying or the banners of a movement, if we look at how you are organized and how you connect to others, and what type of, let's say, otherness or contradiction this organization can bear, and how much connections it can make while allowing those contradictions to exist, that this is a better criteria for what is good organizing and what is, ultimately organizing towards something common than slogans and theories and so on, right? I think that's kind of the question at stake. And that's also why I think that what I'm calling organizational analysis, if it makes any sense and if it is a practical project, it is kind of a practical way with, I think, very weird counterintuitive tools. I think that's what we would end up concluding, of showing organizations to themselves, not from the standpoint of how they identify as political actors, but from the standpoint of the sort of space of political actions they can take, right? Going back to Renzo's kind of distinction between political actors and political actions, right?
Yeah,
Hi,
really
Gabriel.
good answer. I'll let Yasha go next. Yeah.
Okay, you may have already addressed kind of some of this during the presentation, but I'm curious more about this relation between the emergence of psychoanalysis and like how it kind of happened at the same time as the emergence of the nuclear family, right? So when we talk about the like paraconsistent logic of mode A, would you say that it's I don't know, it feels to me almost like the nuclear family is like almost like a classicalization, or like a more classical kinship structure, because there's almost like much less of like an in-between space, right? It's like you're either inside or outside, and kind of these ambiguous relations are almost removed. So I'm curious, in terms of that relationship between the nuclear family and psychoanalysis, how you think that conditions what psychoanalysis was trying to do / is trying to do itself. Like, is it something like trying to, like, I don't know, make mode A less classical and bring more like of a paraconsistent vibe into it? And if yes, how does this because right, that's like at the level of composition, how do those affect kind of like what psychoanalysis can intervene on, or what how psychoanalysis sees or like how it fits on the interaction and intelligibility side.
I'd say that I think that this is a crucial topic. I think we're still kind of halfway through properly developing this, because the issue of nuclear family, I think it touches on three things at the same time. The one thing is, let's say, from purely anthropological kinship structure side, I think that the argument we're trying to make is that the nuclear family is below, or it's subatomic, right? It's not atomic. Like, no one is nuclear, right? It's not the atom, it's just the nucleus of kinship. This means two things. It means that it requires some additional thing to allow for compatibility, ordering, synthesis in the social atomic logic of Badiou, right? You need to add something which is like a ghost to be able to connect these parts, right? But there is a second topic, which is, if you look at the nuclear family, it is also, you can also describe it as if you take mode A, you remove its consistency, so it's kind of like a unbounded kind of basic structure, and then you latch it onto other logic. So you latch the paternal side to the state, so it's where the citizenship goes through. You don't need women to vote, and so you make public only the man in the family. So part of the family is now latched onto the state positively, part is latched on negatively. You latch it onto work also through the man, you positively as the labor force that goes into the factory or whatever, and negatively the women with invisible social reproduction, which also ties her to a child, for example, right? But also in between the two, you tie property rights through hierarchical structures of who gets to inherit what. Through that, state-like relation, you connect it to other generations. And you also connect reproduction to the production of more labor. So you almost see better the nuclear family when you see it from the standpoint of money and property than when you see it from the standpoint of affinity itself or kinship itself. So
Sure.
we could, one point of view is the issue of how it's below, it looks more structured, but it's a bit more dissolved than what was before, right? The fact it became more consistent is proof that it is poorer, so to speak, right? Which is a classicalization, right? Then the other side of that classicalization is, well, to make more classic is also to facilitate composition with mode B. So it becomes a nucleus that binds the three modes rather than guaranteeing the inner binding of mode A, right? And the third point, which is, I think, the most complicated issue, but very interesting and very hard to work through, which is part of the genius of Lévi-Strauss, in my opinion, is that, I mean, this is a classic trope in anthropology, structuralist anthropology, which is to say, to state that the core of kinship relations is affinity and not consanguinity, meaning family is not born of blood, family is born of social relations that then capture blood relations inside of them. So one of Lévi-Strauss's most genius kind of lines for me is in the structure, elementary structures of kinship, where he says that it takes, you know, some humans, like two humans to make a new human. That's like a fact of nature. But which humans are going to be selected, that's a social fact. And it is by using that indetermination in nature and latching on to it that a social and symbolic logic reproduces itself. So consanguinity reproduces symbolic relations rather than symbolic relations reproduce consanguinity. So what that suggests to me is that he had an account of what Badiou calls real atoms, which are precisely the way certain multiples serve as the material basis for logical atoms to reproduce themselves under the proper resolution that is relevant to that world. So in our case, what this means is that we find the point of contact between sex and politics, sex and social world, precisely at that issue, because there are many different things about physiology, reproductive systems, human anatomic traits that have served as the material basis for symbolic logic throughout different societies. It's not true that the men and women divide, you know, is relevant everywhere. It's just not true. It becomes much more relevant to be able to tell these things apart more recently. And it's not true that, you know, being able to generate kids is the fundamental material fact of consanguinity. In totemistic societies, things work very differently. In animistic societies, the cycle of who eats who. So if humans are eaten by certain predators who eat something else as well, that are eaten by something, that circle is much more important to serve as the material basis for the social logic than the fact that humans beget other humans and that these humans, you know, have some characteristics. So the third point about the nuclear family that we would need to develop is the connection between its formation and why sexuality became a privileged point for the atomic logic of this social form, right? Why is it that this particular type of social affinity latches on to sexuality somehow, to the point that you feel sexuality is about more than what it is, right? It's about some sort of social logic you should account for that includes you and so on. So we can hypothesize that as well, and hypothesize that societies that have different social logics will latch on to different characteristics of the social natural material world that involve our social reproduction and natural reproduction, other than, for example, sex reproduction. That might become more meaningless, you know, where other things become more important. So there is, I think that's the third aspect, and psychoanalysis is somewhere between all of these things, right? So for example, yeah, exactly. That's why it's weird in psychoanalysis, everything is supposedly about sexuality, but we have absolutely nothing to say about sexuality. Just people arrive to us kind of claiming, I know sexuality is like the basis of everything. And you're like, yeah, but that doesn't seem to be about sexuality. That seems to be about your mom, you know? And on the other hand, you're putting these familiar structures everywhere, but on the wrong places. So it's kind of about emptying out these things. And I do think we can account for that. I think we can account for why psychoanalysis can only think the problem of love expressed through the problem of sexual difference, even though we have nothing to say about sexual difference. So, which is a bit of a paradox. Like we don't care about those things. You don't need to care about it very much in order to conduct an analysis, but it's kind of how things appear in the clinic. A lot of people speak in that way. And I think psychoanalysis appeared very much at the point, or started being developed very much at the point where these conditions were formed. This kind of dispersion of mode A, this kind of nuclearization of the three modes in the nuclear family, and the latching on to sexuality as a special type of material basis for reproduction of this phantasmatic logic and so on. So there, I think we could kind of go there, you know. I think that's what we're slowly developing. Like, it would be really fun to find out that by mistake or without really focusing on it too much, we ended up proposing like a totally new explanation of why psychoanalysis exists, just as a collateral effect of our serious research. Yeah, man, this is a big issue. Yeah, but this is a big issue of what psychoanalysis is in places where the nuclear family doesn't have such a grip. I mean, this is a big, there are really good studies about this. For example, in Nigeria and other African countries, analysts who moved there or were from there, and there are reports about how different analyses are. In Brazil, you can see that this is much more complicated already. And I think it's definitely, you know, it's a really good test to see if we're going in the right direction, if we have something to say about why those differences are the way they are. So I think that that's a crucial point to pay attention to, you know. I love that it's a bit falsifiable, like, you know, there are things to be explained and things we can predict, right? That it should work different where the nuclear family hasn't latched on too much, right? So yeah.
Incredible. Thank you, Gabriel.
What explains Argentina? How so, Rafa?
Because it seems like if you're in Argentina, you kick a tree and like 3 psychoanalysts fall out. It's like,
Yeah, a good question. It is the most European of Latin American countries. So, I mean, it's the most French of Latin American countries for sure. So that might be kind of...
They even composed the founding national myth in the 19th century, the Facundo.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'd like to think about that a bit more. And yeah, it's an issue. But I also think that, I mean, you know, like if we're right with this, and just as a concluding thought, like I think with this weird line of inquiry, we can kind of give credence to something that, give a bit more substance to something that I silently believe. I kind of think that the future of psychoanalysis is to be divided into 3 things. One is just integrated into science, like neuroscience or whatever, you know, science of consciousness. We're gonna learn some things about how speech works, how, you know, the representation of the psychic space is structured, and it will probably be compatible with some things we thought we knew in psychoanalysis, but we just had some vague intuitions. I think a lot of it is just going to be absorbed by, you know, common political practice, which is what I'm trying to propose here, right? Organizational analysis, if it makes any sense, would be a set of tools that ultimately any organization could use to kind of learn that when you create spaces where freedom is slightly more possible, meaning places where the normative commitments you have cannot be justified socially. You're doing things, you don't need to do them. Why are you doing them? But those places that have that particular type of pressure on people to explain why they are free, those are places where usually you will reproduce certain organizational patterns, which is like transferring them from that social world to that space. So that would be like good practice. And the third thing is that, well, insofar as it has some profound connection with mode A, that a different society with different rules, psychoanalysis will probably just become a type of social relation you can have with other people. You know, like you're in the park, walking your dog, you sit on a bench, somebody sits next to you, you start telling them something, and they have the option of being quiet, listening to you rather than speaking, and you have a listening relation, which is like having friends, having lovers, having colleagues. It's just another relation, you know? So I think that it's going to be divided into these three things. Yeah, I've never seen like a psychoanalysis sci-fi, so that's definitely something I add, even though I mean, out of personal experience, I'd say that it's not sci-fi, it's actually pretty possible. But yeah, I think you can even put, I'm just saying this, say, we can even point to the future, you know, and think about it. So yeah. So anyway, like my idea was just exactly to do what we did, just to have like start having a conversation that can start being a bit more structured about these things. Ultimately, I'd like to bring us back. You know, I can try to schedule another conversation, or we can have like a conversation some other time. I know Bruno sent me a message about meeting up. Like, I'm happy to meet with other people as well. To talk about these things, but my ultimate goal would be to say, okay, from this perspective of this kind of approach, right, where we learn something about transference, and now we're going to see what happens to certain relations of a different type, which are not just mode A, they're broader, they include more things, but how these relations appear. Once you're politically organized, meaning you're not just organized, it's not just like management or administration or getting together, but you're getting together due to a reason you cannot explain fully, because if you could fully explain it, it wouldn't be the reason you're following, right? If you're organizing due to something new, if you could fully spell out your reasons to do it, it wouldn't be the new thing that it is. So you see the similarity with free association. So it's from my hypothesis that it's very likely that in those conditions, organizations will present patterns that are out of place and solve problems that this specific political condition produces. So it is that site that I'm saying it's the site of singular things we're calling organizational pathology. So we come up with strategies to protect ourselves from novelty. It's not from the enemy, right? And that's what I'm asking, if there are ways to be there as organizations to other organizations in ways that facilitate the working through of what is new in the terms of that political language rather than our terms. So that's kind of where I'm going. And I think that that's actually a discussion about toolkits, about concrete problems that people have, you know. So this discussion now is to give more, let's say, confidence, to try to raise your confidence that we can pull something like this off, that we have tools to discuss it, and that it makes like it has some consistency as an approach. But the conversation I would like to have is much more hands-on, right, about it, and about this sort of toolkit for actually meeting others. For example, if this is correct, there is a distinction between individuals meeting individuals and organizations meeting organizations. And what does it mean for an organization to meet another organization, right? It's a problem, I don't know. So there you have it. Like, this is an issue. So Rafael, you asked, psychoanalysis is a type of dyadic relation that could outlive the analytic institutional setting. Yeah, I mean, perhaps not psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis requires this artificial free associative thing. And you don't need to have free association to have a dyadic affinity relation that is not really latching on to anything else, right? But I mean, yeah, I'm not sure if in that particular formulation I would agree, right? Because psychoanalysis outlives psychoanalysis in your statement ultimately, but definitely something outlives it. Yeah,
That's just the language barrier.
yeah, but I agree with the last statement here. I think that this could be the basis for discussing what it means to listen politically in a like serious sense of listening rather than like a condescending one, you know. I think that's it, right? I mean, I think this was the shortest presentation, the smallest amount of slides I've ever used. Really proud of myself.
Still got to get 3 hours out of it though. So
yeah, but I mean, it was a bit more conversational. I hope.
No, but I do think this is just something that I want to like point. I do think that this structure where like we have one continuous presentation and then we have a break and then like I think it has good effects because it allows people to like it makes like I think it benefits more what we do, which is like discuss, but we have a material not everyone is able to read before for whatever reason. So I think it was a really good example of this. I mean,
yeah, I think so too.
I do love our discussions, but
what I will just check with you guys later on is if it's better to schedule, like go back to the waiting list and schedule in a Monday meeting a next installment of this debate, or if I just should make in parallel, depending on how many people want to do it and availability of others. We can just do it in, you know, as a parallel thing that we discussed and think about it.
I think yeah, I agree with Anna. I think the problem is that it's going to be like we are so overbooked because I think in a sense I think, well, it's something that interests the whole group. I mean, it seems like it's the point of the whole group, but at the same time I do think that there's a more practical side, like some tools that are going to be developed that might merit that it has a day of its own. Not a day of its own, but like
not forever, but like yeah.
Not like, oh, let's schedule Sunday mornings. Never something like that. Yeah,
but I mean, I'll go back to the list then, and also, I mean, if anyone wants to continue developing, because you know, I think that without too much work, we can come to a point where, you know, some thoughts we wouldn't have on our own would appear about how to connect with other organizations, which is as far as I want to take this, you know, that some ideas emerge and we say, fuck, yeah, we wouldn't have thought of that without going through this weird detour. Like that's enough for me in terms of perhaps giving us, you know, some interesting kind of approach to the next steps in meeting students and other organizations which we might connect with. Yeah, but anyway, we'll get back to this, and thank you guys so much. All the questions were really, really useful, made me understand much better what I was saying as well.
Thanks.
Okay, bye all.
Really enjoyed this.
See you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.